What if the most powerful words ever spoken by Xi Jinping were never meant to be heard? What if a speech, so radical, so precise, was silenced not because it failed, but because it revealed too much? This is the story of a speech that was never aired, but never fully erased. Hidden in tea rooms, encoded in fiction, whispered in static, the truth was fragmented. Until now. You are about to hear the pieces. This is the voice that was never recorded. Beijing, 2008. The air was unusually thick in the old government building, not with heat, but with a sense of recalibration. Change had arrived, but it wasn't advertised with slogans or banners. It walked in quietly, in the form of a reserved, thoughtful man, Xi Jinping. Assigned to his side was Chen Liang, a seasoned state translator whose true skill wasn't merely language, but observation. He knew how to disappear into rooms, how to register flickers of emotion without judgment, how to hear not just what was said, but what was meant. From day one, Xi and Chen shared an unusual silence. In meetings, Chen would record what was officially said for the archives. But privately, in his leather-bound notebook, he began recording something else entirely. Tone, subtext, hesitation, glance, silence. He titled this private work, The Mirror. In these first months, Xi rarely spoke during diplomatic meetings. When he did, he never answered questions directly. He turned questions into chess moves, reframing, redirecting, redefining. It wasn't politics. It was strategy. Chen noted how she walked. Never rushed. Never idle. Always controlled. Once, during a late-night rehearsal for a televised interview, she stopped mid-sentence, removed his glasses, and looked into the camera light as if confronting a second version of himself. "They'll believe what I say because they'll want to," he whispered. Chen, pretending to adjust his headset, wrote it down. Another time, Chen witnessed Xi give a speech in a closed room to 5 advisors. It wasn't official. No cameras, no media. But Xi's voice shifted, deeper, faster. He spoke of the West not as competition, but as illusion. They won the narrative. "We'll win the mechanism," he said. Chen began to worry. Was this journal now dangerous? He stopped bringing the notebook to meetings. He wrote late at night, by candlelight, in coded phrases. X-red equals narrative shell. Shadow behind light equals real speech. His once simple records turned into puzzles, not just for secrecy, but for safety. Weeks passed, then months, and Chen began to notice something else. She had changed. Or maybe he had always been this way, and only now revealed it. He stopped thanking aides. He reduced jokes. The warmth that once punctuated his small talk grew colder. He was rehearsing for something bigger. One night, Chen was called unexpectedly to a private meeting. No interpreters, no security, just Xi and an empty room. She asked him, "Do you trust your own memory more than a recording?" Chen froze. That night, the mirror gained its most cryptic entry yet. Some truths can't be stored in sound. They echo too far. By the end of 2008, Chen had written over 320 pages of handwritten notes, carefully hidden across 3 locations in Beijing. He told no one. Not his wife. Not his son. Not even his publisher friend. He suspected someone in the Office of Records had flagged him. He wasn't wrong. The following January, someone broke into his study. But they didn't steal anything, they rearranged. A drawer half open. A book spine misaligned. A bookmark moved 3 pages forward. It was a message, "We know." And so began the true story of a man who chronicled not just a leader, but the echo of ambition in human form. The diplomatic wing of Zongnanhai rarely saw sunlight. Its thick walls and courtyard design let in only slivers of natural light, and perhaps this was by design. Here, power didn't boast. It whispered. Xi Jinping had been assigned to host a series of informal tea meetings with representatives from select foreign governments. Nothing official, nothing to be recorded, but everything meant to be remembered. These were soft-launch negotiations, off-script alliances, strategic theater disguised as politeness. Chen Liang was again present, not just as translator, but as ghost. His job was to make meaning fluid, to carry Xi's words through a filter that preserved tone without revealing too much. But even in silence, Xi spoke volumes. The first tea ceremony was with a small team from an Eastern European nation. The room had only 5 chairs. Xi insisted they remove the translation headphones. "Let Mr. Chen take care of everything," he said with a smile. It was a power play, forcing trust, removing barriers. During the meeting, Chen noticed something odd. She kept subtly tapping the side of his porcelain teacup at certain moments. Tap, pause, sip, tap tap, sip. Chen later decoded it. The tapping coincided with moments when she disagreed with what was being said. He didn't interrupt. He didn't argue. He just sent a signal. Next week, a delegate from Japan entered the same room. This time, Chen noticed the tea blend had changed. Jasmine, not oolong. Subtle, but symbolic, jasmine was traditionally linked to purity and mourning in Chinese culture. She opened with a story. "When I was 12, he said, my father was sent away. People came to our house with white gloves, not guns. They took books. They took silence. So I learned to speak only when I had something heavier than silence to offer." The room fell into stunned quiet. It wasn't just a personal story. It was a coded warning. Chen kept translating. In the margins of his notebook, he wrote, "Silence as intimidation. Stillness as weapon." Over the next months, more of these tea meetings occurred. With Russia. With representatives from Africa. Even with a retired U.S. advisor who had, coincidentally, been in Beijing on an academic tour. She never raised his voice. Never made demands. He floated phrases like shared destinies and multipolar necessity, but left interpretation to the listener. Chen realized this was a test. She wasn't just evaluating the guests. He was evaluating him. One evening, after a particularly tense meeting with an Indian diplomat, she turned to Chen and asked, "What do you think he didn't say?" Chen replied, "That he already chose a side." She smirked. "Then he's already lost." That night, Chen wrote something he'd never dared before. He doesn't need to be feared to win. He needs to be misunderstood. Soon after, Chen noticed his translations were being slightly edited after submission. Not major alterations, just enough to shift tone. A softer phrase replaced with something colder. A compliment removed. The edits came from a new unit in the propaganda department. The message was clear. She was beginning to control not only what he said, but what others said about what he said. It was then that Chen began to keep audio recordings, not just transcripts. Hidden behind the lining of his briefcase, a tiny recorder documented entire conversations, including the moments between translations, where she would mutter under his breath, lines not meant for any official record. "You'll see," she once whispered while pouring tea. All of this, ceremony, tradition, it's just code. A language for control. As the tea meetings continued, Chen's notes evolved from linguistic analysis to something darker. Patterns. Routines. Triggers. Xi's eyes would flick left before lying. His hand would twitch before changing subjects. These were not tics. These were tools. And the more Chen noticed, the more invisible he felt. One night, as she walked out of a long session with a Middle Eastern attaché, he looked back at Chen and said, "Even silence leaves a footprint." It wasn't a compliment. It was a warning. And Chen realized he wasn't just recording history. He had become a liability to it. The room was buried beneath layers of bureaucracy, soundproofed by intent rather than insulation. It was known internally as Room 303 White, a space where rehearsals occurred, ideas were spoken aloud, and nothing was recorded officially. Xi Jinping entered alone most days. He preferred to speak thoughts into the room, pacing slowly between two mirrors mounted on opposing walls. It created a strange optical illusion, infinite reflections of a man rehearsing for history. But sometimes, Chen Liang was invited. He stood behind the one-way glass, in a narrow observation booth with no recording devices. He had been told to monitor tone and cadence for speech training. In truth, he was there because she wanted one living witness. Chen took notes furiously. There were no pauses for correction, no "let's do that again" moments. She was not rehearsing. He was constructing. One session stood out among the rest. She stood before the mirror and asked it a question. What happens if I change the vocabulary of an empire? Then, he began speaking, fully, freely, fiercely. He spoke not as the vice president, nor even as a strategist. He spoke as an author rewriting the introduction to a civilization. Gone were the careful turns of phrase. He called the current era a borrowed one, and the existing global order a theater of ghosts. Chen's pen stopped. This wasn't refinement. This was revelation. She spoke of a digital spine for China, an invisible architecture that would outlast armies and sanctions. He mentioned something called the Sky Room Initiative, a project not yet public, designed to algorithmically rank citizen value based on contribution to national narrative cohesion. It was part surveillance, part storytelling, part scorekeeping. Chen didn't write that part down. He simply listened. Later, when she paused, he asked aloud, "If I leave no record, will it all be fiction?" Chen whispered behind the glass, "Only until someone remembers." Weeks passed. Room 303 White saw fewer rehearsals but more internal visits from advisors. One day, she brought in a chalkboard and began sketching out pyramids. Media at the base, data in the middle, myth at the top. "It's not about censorship," she said. "It's about choreography." Chen began having nightmares. In them, Xi's voice echoed in rooms that no longer existed. In one dream, Chen stood in a library where every book was titled Truth, but all pages were blank. He woke up drenched in sweat. He started duplicating his notes and mailing them anonymously to an old professor in Macau. Then came the moment Chen feared. One afternoon, after she had finished a particularly intense session about narrative weaponry, he stopped at the mirror and stared into it. Then he turned, directly at the one-way glass, and said, "How many mirrors do you need before you start seeing ghosts?" Chen froze. He didn't return to room 303 again. Instead, he was reassigned to surface duties, translating public remarks, smiling at visiting guests, correcting Western journalists' terminology. But the mirror sessions haunted him. He began writing them as parables, disguising them in short stories and allegories. One story featured a man who spoke to his reflection so often that the reflection began to speak back, off-script. Xi's off-record speeches became legend among a small internal circle. A few phrases were leaked to party newspapers as unofficial inspiration, but the raw tapes never existed. Because the room had no microphones, no recorders, and no echoes. Only Chen. And Chen remembered. After his quiet removal from internal briefings and one-way mirror sessions, Chen Liang returned home one evening with a strange decision weighing on him. He would no longer try to preserve truth. He would fictionalize it. But not to erase it, to smuggle it. He began writing short stories, allegorical in nature, steeped in metaphors that only those inside the system would understand. His first story was titled, "The Ink That Vanished." It told of a calligrapher whose pen wrote words that disappeared upon sunrise, but were burned into memory forever. He submitted it anonymously to an underground literary journal in Hangzhou. To his surprise, it was published and quietly circulated. Within weeks, a contact left a note in his mailbox. "Write more. The right eyes are watching." Encouraged, Chen wrote again. This time, he crafted a collection titled The Mirror Archive, a compilation of 17 fictional parables. But every parable was a disguised transcript. Xi's lost speeches, reflections, and ideology reimagined as fables. One story described a bird who built a nest out of glass shards, singing only when it rained. Another, of a leader who spoke backwards so that the future could understand him when the past had failed. A literary critic in Shanghai reviewed the book with curious praise. Like reading a forgotten conversation between ideology and time. Within state literature circles, the collection stirred unease. The metaphors were sharp. Too sharp. That's when Chen received a visitor. Not a censor, not a soldier, but an old friend from his university days. She handed him a manila envelope. Inside was a draft manuscript. A biography of Xi Jinping, uncensored and unofficial. It had no listed author. Just a note. If we vanish, the pages must not. Chen began to edit the draft, correcting factual details, inserting quotes he remembered, adjusting timelines. But he refused to add his name. He knew this document couldn't survive in China. So he contacted a retired journalist in Hong Kong, asking for help publishing it abroad. "Use fiction," the journalist warned. "Truth is too dangerous." Chen disguised the biography as a novel, changing names, places, even cultural references, but the structure remained intact. It was a map with invisible ink. He printed 12 copies. 10 were mailed, 2 to Taiwan, 1 to Seoul, 3 to London, and 4 to academic friends in the United States. The 11th copy he hid inside a hollowed-out Buddhist scripture in his uncle's home. The 12th he kept for himself. It was wrapped in silk, tucked inside a drawer beneath his desk. Every few nights, he would reread a passage. Not for editing, but for courage. Then one day, the news broke. Anonymous novel sparks questions about China's narrative control. The book had gone viral online. Not in China, it was blocked immediately. But abroad, scholars, journalists, and even intelligence analysts began dissecting it. They didn't know it was true, but they feared that it might be. Chen began receiving encrypted emails. Anonymous readers asking, "Are you the source? Was this your life? Is the leader real?" He never replied. Until one message stood out. "I found the mirrors." It had no return address. A week later, Chen disappeared. His apartment was untouched. Tea still warm. His copy of the Mirror Archive left open on page 117, a story about a man who erased himself to protect what he remembered. The storm came at 3:14 a.m. Not rain, not thunder, but a digital storm. One that rattled cables, disrupted signals, and whispered through frequencies no human had tuned to in decades. At precisely that moment, across a half-dozen provincial CCTV channels in China, screens flickered. A strange interruption cut through the regular programming. It lasted 17 seconds. No faces. Just a grainy, black-and-white static background. Then a voice. Not angry, not loud. Just deliberate. Measured. Almost hypnotic. "We will not inherit silence. We will forge synchronization." Then, silence. And then, the screen returned to its scheduled program, a local gardening documentary. No official report followed. No media story acknowledged it. But those who saw it remembered every word. A few uploaded shaky phone videos of their TV sets to anonymous forums. The threads were quickly deleted, But not before one linguist posted this. That voice, it matches early 2000s Xi Jinping training tapes. Same tonal pattern. Same linguistic rhythm. Within hours, speculation exploded on encrypted Chinese language networks abroad. A handful of dissidents posted recordings. AI analysts ran spectral comparisons. Deep learning tools estimated a 92.4% match to Xi's voice during his early vice presidency years. The phrase, "the ghost broadcast," was born. Meanwhile, in a quiet town near Chengdu, a retired satellite technician named Wu Yulan opened a file she'd kept on a dusty external drive. It was labeled Z-channel drift _log_0429. She hadn't looked at it in over a decade. Inside, she found a series of untraceable pings routed through decommissioned relay towers. All the pings led to one location, room 303 White. And the timestamps? 2009. 1 year after Chen Liang was last seen. Wu, once part of the internal maintenance crew, remembered the room well. She had installed its signal dampeners herself. And now, she suspected, something had never stopped broadcasting. 1 week later, a private collector in Austria received a mysterious package. Inside was a cassette tape marked in Chinese characters, Echo 7, Inheritance. The tape contained the same 17 seconds of audio, but with an extra phrase at the end, never aired, never leaked. You will bury the sound, but the silence will rot the ground it's buried in. Speculation turned into obsession. The BBC ran a special report. The New York Times referenced it in an article about state secrets. The German intelligence community issued a private briefing. A psychological artifact has entered the global information stream. Contain its reach. In a forgotten library in Taipei, a professor cross-referenced the quote with passages in the Mirror archive. Page 33, a story titled The Last Frequency. Suddenly, everything pointed back to Chen Liang. Only no one could find him. That's when an old archivist at a defunct TV station in Guangdong submitted an anonymous tip. There's a sixth tape. Sixth. He claimed 5 other fragments existed, recordings that had been split and hidden across various archive systems, never fully assembled. And the sixth. It's not a tape, he wrote. It's a person. Later that year, at an academic conference in Toronto, a man in his 70s gave a guest lecture on narrative manipulation in authoritarian states. He spoke softly, never gave his name, wore no ID badge. But one student recorded him. In the lecture, he said, when a system fears memory, it leaves gaps. And in those gaps, you'll find ghosts, not of the dead, but of the silenced. The student asked, "Were you there?" The man smiled. No one was. That's what makes it dangerous. The lecture went viral. People began searching, again, for Chen Liang. Some say he's in Portugal. Others believe he lives in a monastery outside Nepal, writing the final chapters of the Mirror archive by hand. But most agree on one thing: the broadcast was real. And whatever it was meant to say, it wasn't finished. Some voices echo forever, even if they were never recorded. The truth, fragmented, disguised, buried, still finds its way back to the surface. Maybe we'll never know exactly what Xi Jinping said in that erased speech. But we know it scared those who heard it. And fear has a funny way of preserving memory. If this story moved you, made you think, or sparked a question, don't let it end here. Subscribe, leave a comment, and share the silence that was never supposed to speak. Because sometimes, what's hidden tells us more than what's shown.